It is past midnight. The year is 1918. Somewhere in the Ural Mountains, in a city that used to mean nothing to the world, 11 people are being woken from their sleep and told to get dressed. They are told it is for their safety. They are told there is unrest in the city, that they need to move to a lower floor, that it will not take long. One of them is a boy. He is 13 years old. He cannot walk without help. His father carries him down the stairs. They are arranged in 2 rows against the wall of a small stone room. A woman asks for chairs. 2 are brought. She sits. Her daughter sits beside her. They wait. The door opens. To understand that basement, you have to understand what was lost to reach it, and how fast the losing happened. In 1913, the House of Romanov celebrated 300 years of rule over Russia, 3 centuries, 1 family, an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. Nicholas II stood at the center of it, not as a tyrant exactly, but as something perhaps more dangerous. A man who genuinely believed God had appointed him to rule. A man who could not imagine the alternative because the alternative had never been made real to him. He was, by most accounts, a devoted husband, a loving father, a man who kept a meticulous diary and enjoyed long walks and photography. He was also, by nearly every account, catastrophically unsuited for the moment history had handed him. The 1905 revolution had been a warning. He heard it. He did not change. The First World War bled Russia of 2 million men and then kept bleeding. His wife Alexandra, deeply under the influence of a man named Rasputin, pushed him toward autocracy when the country was screaming for reform. By February 1917, the screaming won. The February Revolution came not with a single explosion, but with a queue for bread that did not end, soldiers refusing to fire on civilians, a government that dissolved like paper in rain. Nicholas, on a train returning from the front, found the tracks blocked. He abdicated on March 15, 1917. The 300-year dynasty ended in a railway car in the middle of nowhere with a fountain pen. He asked to be allowed to go to England. His cousin George V, the British king, initially agreed, then quietly withdrew the offer, fearing the optics. The Romanovs were left behind. For 8 months they were held at the Alexandra Palace in comfortable confinement. Then the Bolsheviks took power. Then comfort became negotiable. By the spring of 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son Alexei, had been moved east, away from Petrograd, away from any possible rescue, away from the world. They arrived in Yekaterinburg on April 30th. The locals called it the House of Special Purpose. Its real name was the Ipatiev House, after the merchant who'd owned it before the Bolsheviks requisitioned it for this particular use. The fence had been raised specifically so no one could see in or out. The windows on the ground floor were painted over with lime. Inside, the family lived in 4 rooms. They were watched constantly. The guards were coarse, sometimes cruel. Slogans were scrawled on the walls. Their mail was intercepted. Their walks were shortened, then shortened again. Alexei, the only son, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that meant any bruise, any small injury could spiral into agony. He spent much of his time in a wheelchair or in bed. His parents watched him with the specific exhaustion of people who have been afraid for a long time. Alexandra wrote in her diary almost daily. The entries in the final weeks are quiet, banal even. She records the weather, she notes when Alexei has a bad day, she transcribes scripture. On June 27th, she notes that a Bolshevik guard drew a picture on the wall. She writes that she found it offensive. She had no way of knowing that men in Moscow were already deciding. In early July, a coded telegram arrived in Yekaterinburg from the Ural Soviet, the regional Bolshevik authority. The White Army, fighting to restore the monarchy, was advancing on the city. They were getting close. The order, when it finally came, was clear. The family could not be allowed to become a symbol. They could not be rescued. They could not stand trial, because a trial would give them a stage. There was only one solution that solved every problem at once. The commandant of the Ipatiev house was a man named Yakov Yurovsky. He spent the day of July 16th making arrangements. It was shortly after midnight when Yurovsky woke the family and the 4 servants who had stayed with them. He told them to dress and come downstairs. There was danger in the city. They needed to move. Nicholas carried Alexei in his arms. They were brought into the basement room, roughly 5 meters by 6. When Alexandra asked for chairs, 2 were brought. She sat on one. Alexei was placed in the other. The others arranged themselves around them. Yurovsky entered with a group of men. He read from a paper. He said the Ural Soviet had sentenced them to death. Nicholas said, "What?" Then it began. The shooting was chaotic. The room was small. The smoke was immediate and blinding. Some of the daughters had jewels sewn into their corsets. Not for vanity, but because they'd hidden them there as assets for whatever future they'd imagined. The jewels deflected bullets. The girls took longer to die. Alexei, on the floor and still breathing, was killed with a shot at close range. It took approximately 20 minutes. Yurovsky wrote about it later, clinically, the way a man writes when he needs to believe he was only doing a job. The bodies were wrapped in sheets and driven 40 miles to a field near a place called Koptyaki. They were stripped, doused in acid, burned, and buried in a pit. Then, days later, dug up and reburied in 2 separate locations, because someone feared the first site was too obvious. For 70 years, the Soviet government denied it, deflected it, buried it the way they buried everything inconvenient. There were rumors, there were survivors claimed. A woman called Anna Anderson spent decades insisting she was Anastasia. She was not. In 1991, the Soviet Union was gone, and a grave in a Russian forest was finally opened. DNA testing, comparing the remains to living relatives of the Romanovs, confirmed what everyone had known and no one had been allowed to say. Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, the servants. A second grave, found in 2007, contained Alexei and the 4th daughter. The entire family, confirmed, identified, accounted for. They were given a state funeral in 1998, 80 years late. What happened in that basement was not the end of something. That is the terrible part. It was the beginning. The Bolsheviks who ordered that execution would go on to build a system that killed tens of millions. The 20th century, the bloodiest in recorded human history, was already underway. The Romanovs were not innocent. Their rule had its own weight of suffering. But 11 people in a basement at midnight are simply 11 people in a basement at midnight. And the logic that put them there, that some lives can be erased cleanly for the sake of an idea, that logic did not stop in that room. It is still working somewhere right now. The bare bulb swings, the dust floats, the floor is cold stone, and somewhere a door is opening.